Hey everybody, this is chapter 3 of Russell Jacoby's Dialectic of Defeat. Contours of Western Marxism. Chapter 3 is titled From Philosophy to Politics, the Inception of Western Marxism. And again, I think there's already a better recording of this on the internet by Adriesta's Revolt. Can't remember the name. So go listen to their thing and not mine. You'll find it better. The term, quote, Western Marxism and, quote, European Marxism entered Marxist dictionaries in the early 1920s. The Soviet edition listed it as derogatory. By implying that a specific Marxism belonged to Western Europe, the universality of Bolshevism and the Third Communist International, the Comintern, was threatened. To participants, this threat was not instantly evident. Moreover, the political and philosophical layers of Western Marxism unpeeled sequentially. At least this is how it appeared to Korsch when he looked back. First, a specific Western Marxist politics shaped, and later its philosophy was elaborated. Shit, where am I? God damn it. Footnote. My disagreements with Perry Anderson's book, Considerations on Western Marxism, should be evident from the introduction and preceding chapters. For two good critical reviews, see Richard D. Wolff in Monthly Review, 1978, and Jeffrey Herf in Socialist Revolution, 1977, Alvin W. Gouldner, The Two Marxisms. If you don't know who Jeffrey Herf is a very important scholar of anti-Semitism, Germany, and Israel. He translated the I think it's one of the books on here, History and Structure, by Alfred Schmidt. So here we go. Sorry about that. Quote, as it moved westwards, Korsch explained in 1930, quote, this Marxist-Leninist philosophy of the Russians encountered the work of Lukács, myself, and other, quote, Western communists, which formed an antagonistic philosophical tendency within the Communist International itself. Unquote. Korsch added, quote, this philosophical discussion was only a weak echo of the political and tactical disputes the two sides had conducted so fiercely some years before. Unquote. Of these political disputes, Korsch mentioned two: Rosa Luxemburg's criticism of the Russian Revolution and the conflict between the Bolsheviks and the, quote, radical left tendency, led by the Dutchmen Anton Pannekoek and Herman Gorter. Footnote, see Karl Korsch, Marxism and Philosophy. A quote, weak echo, World War I, the collapse of the Second International, the radicalization of the working class, the Russian Revolution, brief Western European revolutions, the founding of the Third International, and the new communist parties resonated for decades. The magnitude and profundity of these upheavals damned philosophical discussions to irrelevancy. By 1923, however, when Korsch and Lukács published their major philosophical works, the revolutionary surges had subsided. Politics lost in immediacy, or at least the options contracted. This was not only hindsight. Lenin, Trotsky, and others remarked on the slowing of the historical tempo. Footnote, quote, "It is absolutely incontestable that on a world scale the open revolutionary struggle of the proletariat for power is at present passing through a stoppage, a slowing down in tempo," end quote. Trotsky, in Theses on the International Situation and the Tasks of the Comintern, 1921, available in the first 5 years of the Communist International, Volume 1. End footnote. The task was to dig in and prepare. If the political collisions are forgotten, the weak echo might be mistaken for the thunder itself. The philosophical feuds cannot be understood abstracted from the preceding political conflicts, nor are they identical to these conflicts. Politics permeated philosophy but did not replace it. Latent political choices infused the theoretical debates. The density of philosophy and politics in this period was not unique in the history of Marxism. However, no formula for the relationship of philosophy and politics exists. This relationship is complex and historically specific. Philosophy participated in a constellation of tactics and organizations. It cannot be reduced to them or for that reason dismissed. Lenin himself fell victim to the entanglement of philosophy and politics. His major philosophical work, entitled Materialism and Imperial Criticism, sharply attacked the followers of Ernst Mach and Richard Avenarius. Yet a political embarrassment marked his philosophical offensive. Many followers of Mach were political allies of Lenin, as was Alexander Bogdanov for a period. Conversely, the philosopher that Lenin prized most, Plekhanov, was a political opponent. For these reasons, Lenin sought to separate the philosophical and political issues. Footnote. At the time the book, Materialism and Imperial Criticism, appeared in 1909 during the onslaught against the followers of Ernst Mach and Richard Avenarius, Plekhanov was a political opponent, yet he was the philosopher Lenin valued the most. Because of this embarrassment, Lenin worked energetically to separate philosophical from political disputes. As Lenin explained to Gorky, quote, "In the summer and autumn of 1904, Bogdanov and I reached a complete agreement as Bolsheviks and formed the Tacit Bloc, which tacitly ruled out philosophy as a neutral field," end quote. The embarrassment was compounded by Bogdanov being not only Lenin's close political ally, but a prime philosophical offender. For this reason, Lenin wanted to preserve the political agreement while excluding the grave philosophical differences. Quote, "Proletariat must remain absolutely neutral towards all divergences in philosophy and not give the reader the slightest grounds for associating the Bolsheviks as a trend with imperial criticism or imperial monism," end quote. Lenin. See Lenin and Gorky, Letters, Reminiscences, Articles, published in Moscow in 1973. It was in this period that Lenin protested in Die Neue Zeit when it mentioned that the philosophical disputes in the Russian Party were also political disputes. Quote, "This philosophical controversy is not a factional one. Both factions contain adherents of two philosophical trends," end quote. Lenin. From Statement of the Editors of Proletariat in Lenin's Collected Works, Volume 13. The point here is only that where politics and philosophy seem to present no problem in Lenin, there is a tangled relationship. Although Lenin was convinced that Mach's doctrine was, quote, "ridiculous, harmful, Philistine fides," end quote, he could also write, quote, I say separate the fight from the faction. Of course, such a separation on living persons is rather difficult and painful," end quote. Lenin. Not only was it difficult, it did not turn out to be feasible. One of the best accounts of these events is in David Jurovsky's book, Soviet Marxism and Natural Science, published in 1961. See Manuel Sacristan's article, Lenin et la Filosofia, published in Critica Marxista, 1971. On Bogdanov, see Dietrich Grilla's book, Lenin's Rivala, Bogdanov und seine Philosophie, published in 1966. For a partial rebuttal of Grilla, see George Katkov's article, Lenin as Philosopher, published in the book Lenin, the Man, the Theorist, the Leader, edited by L. Shapiro and P. Redaway, published in 1967. See also A. Bogdanov in the book Makers of the Russian Revolution, Biographies of Bolshevik Leaders, edited by G. Haupt and J.J. Marie, published in 1974. See Bertram Wolf's book, Three Who Made a Revolution, published in 1964. And Robert S. Cohen's article, Monist and Marxist, Bogdanov and Lenin, in Ernst Mach, edited by R.S. Cohen, 1970. For an account of Lenin's attitude, see Nikolai Valentinov's memoir, Encounters with Lenin, 1968, published in 1968. And footnote. For a few years after World War I, the political arena seemed wide open. By the end of 1923, the last post-World War I offensive, the German October, was history, and even by 1921, the defeat of European revolutions was a fact. Yet the brevity of the period does not deprive it of importance. In these years, the political contours of a Western Marxism surfaced. The situation rarely reoccurred. The consolidation of the Russian Revolution and the rise of fascism, if they did not spell imprisonment and death, compelled unorthodox Marxists to silently table their heresies or retreat from the political barricades. The history of Western Marxism between the mid-1920s and the 1950s is largely a history of these two choices. A word of caution: to shift in parts of this and the next chapter from delineating two traditions of Hegel to the politics of the Comintern and communist parties is to enter a new world. No longer is the talk of Hegel's book Logic or Hegel's phenomenology, but the, quote, 21 conditions, the March action, and the Bettelheimerei. And even Bettelheimerei? I don't know what the hell that means. The cast of characters in political parties is long. What N.O. Brown wrote to explain his use of the, quote, strange language, in quote, of Freud, quote, but this strange world is the world we all of us actually live in, end quote. Can perhaps be reformulated. This strange world is the world they, if no longer all of us, actually live in. For this reason, it cannot be avoided. Footnote. See Norman O. Brown's book, Life Against Death, and footnote. This chapter, however, seeks to pare away, as much as is feasible, extraneous details, names, and events. In this way, the danger of drowning in a sea of political incidents may be prevented and the contours of a political Western Marxism thrown into relief. The story, in any case, was fragmentary, brief, and finally, quote, unsuccessful. Yet Rosa Luxemburg, Paul Levy, and Dutch and, quote, left communists posed a series of political alternatives to the rapidly consolidating Soviet communism. And there's big differences to be put between those people. For instance, I think Rosa Luxemburg and Paul Levy came from more of like the Berlin-centered radical left, and the left communists that are associated with like Pannekoek and stuff were centered in like Bremen, or like the people who would kind of be like the more libertarian wing of what became the communist movement were in Bremen. And then obviously Rosa Luxemburg is killed. Paul Levy is like expelled. Was like the kind of like the president or like the leader of the German Communist Party for a while, to my understanding, and then was kicked out. And then the Dutch and the left communists, I can't remember when they were expelled. I think it was like really early, like 1920, the KAPD forms. Which, due to Pannekoek living in Germany, and having close connections there and kind of building up something of a current around his ideas, has a strong connection between the Dutch scene and the German scene. I have a short biography on Paul Levy on this channel. I have a number of pieces about Rosa Luxemburg on this channel, and I have a lot of pieces from the Dutch and left council communists and the left communists who went on to become council communists on this channel. So check that out. Paul Levy is an important figure. I think it's actually Levy is how you pronounce it. But anyway, they challenged the validity of Western Europe of the Russian experience and the Leninist model. As often, perhaps always in the history of Marxism, the question of organization proved to be the terrain for political and theoretical jousting. The question incorporated a group of principles that set Marxist against Marxist. Lukács stated succinctly, quote, organization is the form of mediation between theory and practice, end quote. Lukács, in History and Class Consciousness. A simple preference for democratic organizations did not dictate the Western Marxist repudiation of Leninism. Rather, to the Western Marxists, the yawning political and social gap between Europe and Russia prohibited an identical praxis for each. Again, Lukács was part of the mainstream communist movement and recanted a lot of what he had to say, to my understanding at least, recanted a lot of what he had to say in History and Class Consciousness. And also Karl Korsch, when he wrote Marxism and Philosophy, was not yet a left communist, but rather at that point still a rather orthodox Leninist. This was in Korsch's Leninist phase. Only later did he become a left communist and then a council communist with sympathies towards anarchism. Check out the two pieces. I have two biography kind of things on here about Karl Korsch, one by Patrick Good and one by Douglas Kellner. The Douglas Kellner one focuses a little bit more on the politics. The Good one focuses a little bit more on the philosophy. Anyway, Leninism bore the indelible mark of specific Russian conditions, a relatively small proletariat, a massive agrarian population, a feeble bourgeois culture. The last was decisive. The impact of bourgeois and national culture sharply distinguished Western European from Russian society. As Gorter wrote, in the Netherlands, the oldest capitalist country, bourgeois culture and values were drummed into the working class for centuries. The same could not be said of Russia. Leninism was not blind to bourgeois culture. Leninism responded by contracting to a tighter and more disciplined party. The infection of bourgeois culture was attributed to trade unions or a, quote, aristocracy of the working class. Since the infectious source was discrete, the organizational prescription could be sharply defined. To the Western Marxists, however, bourgeois culture was endemic and inescapable. An organizational solution did not suffice. The Western Marxists responded by retrieving from Marxism the process of class consciousness and proletarian subjectivity. And that was kind of like the big crux. I mean, a lot of times I think, especially with the influence of Matic being, I think, kind of, even though he's younger, I think he's kind of a core figure for spreading council communism globally, especially the fact that he international council correspondence kind of was based out of the United States, to my memory, he being the editor. Maybe it was a different journal, but he obviously Living Marxism and then New Essays, or the different journals that he had, was definitely responsible for kind of spreading this body of ideas throughout the world, very important. And because of that, his importance, which is important, he's a very important figure and a very interesting figure in theory. The influence of Grossman upon him, which very much is based upon the objective necessity of communism and the which was kind of steeped in a collapse theory based on Grossman's work, kind of has this certain to my impersonal kind of dimensions to it. Impersonally, the capitalism is going to force the proletariat to act in a self-determining way and establish a council system and so on and so forth. There's there's a lot of what Jacoby calls in other places automatic Marxism. I think it's Jacoby who uses that term. Maybe it's someone else. Within the council communist tradition, but for people like Pannekoek and Gorter and other people who were a little less didn't have that Grossman influence, what was really important for them was the subjective self-confidence of the Western working class to strike on its own and not subordinate itself either to bourgeois politics, obviously, but also to leadership structures. So that's very important. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind, is that consciousness was very important for the council communists. At least those especially who were influenced especially by Pannekoek, for instance. Check out the biography I have of Pannekoek on here by John Gerber. Anyway, where the hell am I? The Western Marxist accent on process resulted from their conviction that class consciousness was not a thing to be commanded or divulged, but attained by the class itself. Herein dwelled the democratic ethos of Western Marxism. The network of bourgeois culture and passivity could not be undone by superior discipline or directives. These remained locked within its terms, regardless of the purity and dedication of the party and its members. Rather, bourgeois hegemony could be contested only by engaging the whole of the proletariat, its hearts and minds. When class consciousness and proletarian subjectivity fused, the landscape of capitalism would light up. In this period, the coherence of Western Marxism and, quote, left communism was little evident. That many, quote, left communists considered themselves loyal Leninists, and that it took Lenin to disabuse them of the illusion, suggests the confusion, nor were the theoretical sources identical. Korsch, Lukács, Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, and later, French Marxism were rooted in German idealism and the historical Hegel. This is not true for the Dutch Marxists who took more to Dietgen than to Hegel. Exceptions do not prove the rule, yet the Dutch Marxists are not exceptions in that the same categories surfaced in all corners of Western Marxism. And it seems like, to me, from my reading of Pannekoek's biography, that at least him in particular, was more influenced by Dietgen than by Engels, like on the philosophical terrain in terms of like philosophy of science and philosophy, like the relation between society and nature and so forth. And also like it seemed like, from my impression was, if you like following Z.A. Jordan, that Marx can't be properly called a materialist, but rather like a naturalist, in the sense that he like embraced a completely like secular worldview, didn't believe in God or like believe in like kind of like some transcendent logos, very much what's the word? I suppose the word might be immanentist, monist in some way, but the materialism being like a more specific form of naturalism, which can't be applied to Marx, which in the same way that it can be applied to Engels. But if you're following that kind of logic, right, it seems like Pannekoek's, at least this is my perception, Pannekoek's conception of materialism was not something that was kind of like just like some kind of like physical reductionist kind of materialism, ideas and affect subjectivity were as much material as anything else, or as any other things that are like in the actual world. They have like an existence, and that existence, it seems like from my memory of the reading, that like it wasn't just kind of like epiphenomenal, right? It wasn't just like, oh yeah, people have consciousness, but it doesn't like have any causal relations. For like Pannekoek, it seemed like no, like consciousness and subjectivity have causal power in the world. They're not just something that are caused, but actually do cause things. So it seemed like there's even though it doesn't, yeah, like I don't remember reading that biography, I don't remember anything about Pannekoek talking about Hegel at all. But it seems like he was kind of had a more critical disposition towards like dogmatic dialectical materialism as it came to be than other people. At least that's my understanding. New section, Section 1. Korsch mentioned Rosa Luxemburg's critique of the Russian Revolution as one political backdrop to the philosophical disputes. Despite or because of all the secondary literature, Luxemburg resists classification. If the interpretation of Engels indexed the philosophical separation between Western and Soviet Marxism, Luxemburg indexed the political split. For years in the Third International, quote, Luxemburgism spelled heresy. The fate of her collected works suggested the difficulty of slipping her into the conventional categories. Their publications, sponsored by the Communist Party, ceased in the late 1920s. Only after some 40 years' delay did the project recommence. Footnote. The first edition of the collected works ceased when its editor, Paul Frulich, was expelled from the Communist Party in 1928. See Eyring Fetcher's postscript to Paul Frulich's Rosa Luxemburg, 1972. I'd like to read that. That sounds interesting. Check out the piece I have on here, the book I have on here by Eyring Fetcher, titled Marx and Marxism. Perspectives on Luxemburg and Lenin, or Luxemburg and the Bolsheviks, are themselves subject to a historical dynamic. Footnote. Gilbert Badia notes that efforts to reconcile Lenin and Luxemburg have increased since the death of Stalin. See his book, Rosa Luxemburg, published in 1975. End footnote. In recent years, her differences with Lenin have been belittled. With no hesitation, she has given the official stamp of orthodox Marxist. Footnote. See, for example, Norman Garris, The Legacy of Rosa Luxemburg. Yeah, I think Garris tries to kind of like make Leninism compatible with Luxemburgism, which I personally don't think is viable. Maybe you disagree on that. And I'm not an expert on Lenin or Luxemburg, so take my opinion with a grain of salt, but I don't see that. I think there's a whole radically different approach between political activists or party members and like the average person on the street. That is radically different from how there's a radically different political orientation to the working class between Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin that I don't think is reconcilable. But yeah, that's definitely a thing where it's like kind of like she's one of those people that like everyone tries to fight over, right? People try to fight over Rosa Luxemburg. Some people try to turn her into just a Democrat, like one of the most. Obviously, she's one of the most like important like people advocating the democratic, mass participatory content of Marxism. But they also try to erase the fact that she was like in fact an insurgent, like believed in revolution, democratic Marxist revolution, democratic socialist revolution. But she was definitely a revolutionist and was not like she was like anti-parliamentarian, but she was anti-parliamentarianism as like a political goal. Some people try to, the council communists claim her as their own. Leninists try to counter as their own. People more social democratic try to counter as their own. So it's like there's definitely like a history of struggle over like who is the correct inheritor of Rosa Luxemburg's body of political thought and activity. Anyway, originally this effort hit serious snags, and one of the most serious was her successor in the German Communist Party, KPD, Paul Levy. Levy mediated the impact of Luxemburg on European Marxism. He not only led the most important communist party outside the Soviet, but Levy published Luxemburg's critique of the Russian Revolution as proof of her profound antipathy to Bolshevism. Although neither her pupil nor her equal, Levy remained a loyal follower. Beginning as her lawyer in 1913, Levy belonged to both her personal and political inner circle. Shortly after Luxemburg's assassination in January 1919, Levy succeeded her as leader of the German Communist Party. Within 2 years, he moved from the leadership to opposition to expulsion in 1921. Some 10 years after the murder of Rosa Luxemburg, Paul Levy committed suicide. In any discussion of Levy, Luxemburg, and subsequent splits in the party, the fundamental importance of German communism to the Russian Revolution and the Third International should not be forgotten. Footnote. On Levy, see generally I don't know how to say this person's name. I want to say Charlotte Barat, but I feel like it's in German, so it's like Charlotte Barat, I don't know. Paul Levy, published in Frankfurt, 1969. See also Helmut Gruber's article, Paul Levy and the Comintern, in the book International Communism in the Era of Lenin, edited by H. Gruber. And footnote. In any discussion of Lenin, where the hell am I? The German party was not another or even major party. It was the party, and initially nearly overshadowed the Russian party. Before World War I, the German Social Democrats, SPD, were the leading party. After the war, it was desperately hoped that the German Revolution would bail out the Russian Revolution. Early conferences of the Comintern were conducted in German, and its Moscow headquarters was considered stopgap until the wider European revolutions rendered possible its relocation to Berlin. Footnote. See E.H. Carr, The Bolshevik Revolution, 1917 to 1923, Volume 3. See Branko Lazic and Milorad M. Drakovich's book, Lenin and the Comintern, Volume 1, published in 1972. Nor was this all fantasy. The KPD wielded considerable clout. For instance, in 1924, the KPD received 3.7 million votes in Reichstag elections. In 1927, it was publishing 36 daily newspapers. Considering the dire straits of the Russian Revolution and the wealth, experience, and apparent expertise of the German working class movement, all of its developments were carefully monitored, guided, and finally controlled. Footnote. See the figures in Hermann Weber's book, Die Wandlung des deutschen Kommunismus, Volume 1. I think I have a piece by Hermann Weber on this channel about Rudolf Barrow and his kind of like theoretical and historical context. I think Hermann Weber is also kind of an expert on the GDR as well. I think that's kind of like his main claim to fame. West German scholar, expert on GDR. Anyway, considering the dire straits of the Russian Revolution, where the hell am I? Levy's presence at the Congress of Livorno, January 1921, provoked his first public opposition to the Soviets. Footnote. See especially Richard Lowenthal's essay, The Bolshevization of the Spartacus League, published in International Communism, edited by D. Footman, 1960. See also Robert S. Lindemann's book, The quote, Red Years, European Socialism versus Bolshevism, 1919 to 1921, published in 1974. End footnote. At this Congress, the Italian Communist Party, PCI, was founded by splitting the Italian Socialist Party, PSI. This is neither surprising nor unanticipated. It was in accord with Comintern policy to expel or withdraw from the reformists of the old socialist parties. In Italy, the political parties and groups debated for months which conditions of entry into the Comintern were acceptable. The Comintern and its representatives encouraged a hard line, a clean break with a wide number of reformists. They achieved their aim, but with only 1/3 of the votes from the Congress. They departed to form the PCI. Because less than half the membership of the Socialist Party of Italy renewed in either party, some historians consider the split of Livorno a fatal mistake for the Italian left. Quote, although a schism of the party seemed warranted by the facts, the particular schism that occurred at Livorno was disastrous. Thanks to that Congress and to Mussolini, the Italian left was eliminated from political life for the next 22 years. End quote. John M. Comet, Antonio Gramsci and the Origins of Italian Communism. See also Gaetano Arfei, Storia del Socialismo Italiano, 1892 to 1926, published in 1965. End footnote. Levy returned from Livorno upset by what he had witnessed. He was repelled by the crudity of the Comintern representatives who promoted the split. He proceeded he presented a criticism of the Comintern tactics to his own Central Committee. To those who argued that it was better to be, quote, few in number but firm in principle, end quote, Levy replied that, quote, principles without followers constitute a party no more than followers without principles, end quote. Levy. In Levy's eyes, the Comintern employed tactics unsuitable for Western European parties. Footnote. Levy addressed the Congress at Livorno, yet his pronouncements and his private conduct diverged. Publicly, he called for a split, and privately, he worked to prevent one. See Luigi Cortesi's book, Il Socialismo Italiano fra Riforme e Rivoluzione, published in 1969. In his remarks, he stated that the German party did not believe in preserving unity at all costs, and that moments arrived in party life when it was necessary to separate from former comrades. End footnote. Footnote. See Levy's published report titled Der Parteitag der Italienischen Partei, published in Die Rote Fahne, number 37, January 23, 1921, This is anonymous, but the reply by P.B. Karl Radek identified Levy as the author. P.B. Die C. Radek as P.B. Die Spaltung der italienischen Sozialistischen Partei und die Kommunistische Internationale, published in Die Rote Fahne, number 41, January 26, 1921. And footnote. Footnote. See Levy's article, Der Beginn der Krise in der Kommunistischen Partei und Internationale, delivered February 24, 1921, excerpts in the book International Communism, edited by Gruber. And footnote. Footnote. See Report of Comrade Levy to the Executive Committee of the Third International in the Italian Party Congress, January 20th, 1921, and Sessions of the Centrale with the representatives of the Executive Committee for Germany, published in January 28th, 1921. These are private statements, both published in the book The Comintern Historical Highlights, edited by M.M. Jacoby and B. Lazich, published in 1966. End footnote. Levy objected to the, quote, mechanical split of the Italian party, preferring the, quote, organic bringing up, end quote, of the masses, quote, to create parties within the Communist International, not through organic growth of the masses, but through deliberate splits, end quote, was risky and unproductive. Quote, if the Communist International functions in Western Europe in terms of admission and expulsion like a recoiling cannon, then we will experience in Western Europe the worst possible setback, end quote. Levy. Footnote. See Levy, that quote's from Levy, Beginning of the Crisis, published in the book International Communism, edited by Gruber. Levy was vulnerable on a key point. He himself had helped split the USPD. He maintained, however, that this was a very different matter from splitting the Italian Socialist Party. The USPD was a, quote, the split from the USPD was a, quote, organic split and created a mass revolutionary party. The latter was artificial and destroyed a mass revolutionary party. The USPD has recently received detailed attention. See Hartford Krause's book USPD, published in Frankfurt in 1975. David W. Morgan's book The Socialist Left in the German Revolution, A History of the German Independent Socialist Democratic Party, 1917 to 1922. And Robert F. Wheeler's book USPD und Internationale. And footnote. Footnote. In Levy's opinion, the Russians erased the distinction between Western Europe and Russia. They blindly applied the same organizational principles to each. Quote, it seems to me that the comrades did not clearly realize that splits in a mass party with a different intellectual structure, bracket, eine andere geistige Struktur, than, for example, that of the illegal Russian party, which performed brilliantly in its own way, cannot be carried on the basis of resolutions, but only on the basis of political experience, end quote. Levy. The language and approach recalled Luxemburg's distrust of politics commanded by inflexible resolutions. Levy appealed directly to Luxemburg's legacy. Quote, I do not want to conceal anything. The old difference between Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin emerges here again, end quote. Levy. Footnote. That quote's from Levy, The Beginning of the Crisis in the Communist Party and International, available in International Communism, edited by Gruber. And footnote. Levy's criticism of the Comintern's conduct in Livorno was unacceptable to the New Orthodoxy, nor did it help that Levy raised the sensitive issue of relocating to the west the Comintern headquarters. Footnote. Levy believed that after the establishment of a European proletarian state, the Comintern should be relocated in the west. This is essentially Luxemburg's position. And footnote. Levy was outvoted in his own Central Committee, which, with other supporters, he resigned from the Central Committee and consequently watched from the sidelines the increasing subordination of the KPD to the Comintern. Levy did not have long to wait. Within weeks of his resignation, the Comintern decisively intervened in the KPD in what came to be known as the March Action, 1921. This has been called the, quote, first insurrection in Europe attempted at the instigation and under the leadership of a team specially sent from Moscow, end quote. Lazich and Jacoby, Lenin and the Comintern, Volume 1. As a revolution, it was a debacle. The KPD membership dwindled from 450,000 to 180,000 as one consequence. It also marked a, quote, turning point in the relation of the KPD to Moscow. From this time on, the integrity and autonomy of the German Communist Party dramatically declined. Footnote. For the statement of those resigning, which included Clara Zetkin, see Sitzung des Zentralausschusses, published in Die Rote Fahne, February 1921. See the piece EECI, Resolution on the Resignation of 5 members from the Central Committee of the German Communist Party from March 1921, which is available in the book Communist International 1919 to 1943, edited by J. de Grasse, published in London 1956. Footnote. The March Action was a, quote, turning point in the history of both German communism, and of Soviet policy, end quote. E. H. Carr, The Bolshevik Revolution, Volume 3. See generally Werner T. Ongres. This is his book, Stillborn Revolution, The Communist Bid for Power in Germany, 1921-23, published in 1963. By surgically separating the March Action from the Comintern, Perry Anderson, in the article The Antinomies of Antonio Gramsci in New Left Review in 1976 to 1977, seeks to exonerate Lenin and Trotsky. In fact, the March Action was partly engineered by the Comintern and unopposed by Lenin and Trotsky, and they both endorsed the expulsion of Levy for his public criticism of the March Action. See Lazich and Jacoby's book, Lenin and the Comintern. Whether Lenin approved the action in advance is questionable. For one bit of evidence, see the testimony of Bernhard Reichenbach, who recorded that Lenin reversed himself on the March Action under the influence of Clara Zetkin. See B. Reichenbach's article, Moscow 1921, Meeting in the Kremlin, published in Survey number 53, October 1964. End footnote. To Levy, the ill-conceived and ill-executed March Action proved that the KPD and the Comintern were out of touch with the proletarian masses. As Levy explained in a letter to Lenin, the March Action wrecked the painstaking work of the past 2 years. Not only the effort to numerically enlarge the Communist Party, but the effort to root it, quote, culturally in the proletarian masses was profoundly set back. The, quote, trust of the proletarian class that the former leadership had sweated to gain was sabotaged. Levy's full indictment of the March Action earned him expulsion from the party. In the book Unser Weg, Wider der Putschismus, Our Path Against Putschism, published in 1921, Levy argued that the party and the Comintern representatives organized a putsch, not a Marxist revolution. Theoretically, Levy's critique moved within the parameters of Western Marxism. The Soviet Party, by virtue of its past as an illegal party in an agrarian country, was incapable of understanding the revolutionary traditions of the West European proletariat. The Russians bypassed the, quote, cultural structure to incite the proletariat directly by a battery of resolutions and leaflets. Levy commented later, quote, it's the same old nonsense that Moscow always wants to believe, namely that a Soviet-type revolution would have occurred by now if there weren't a Cerati in Italy or a Levy in Germany standing in the way. The Muscovites completely overlook the fact that conditions in Western Europe are utterly different from those in Russia. There you had an agrarian revolution with some 95% of the population in favor. In Germany, the peasants are counter-revolutionary. In Western Europe, the proletariat is tightly organized. In Russia, the masses were not organized. These are some of the differences that Moscow one day will have to try to grasp. End quote. Levy. Footnote. That quote is from undated letters cited in Lazich and Drakovich, Lenin and the Comintern, page 512. They even made the same points in Was ist das Verbrechen, die Märzaction oder die Kritik daran, speech at the May 4th, 1921 meeting of the Central Committee of the VKPD. Appealing to Luxemburg, he argued that the social relations in Western Europe and Russia differed. In the former, the proletariat faced a, quote, fully developed bourgeoisie, end quote, and required an open mass party that could not act on orders of a central committee. For another statement, see his article, Die Parteitag der VKPD, Unser Weg, Soviet, 1921. Unser Weg, the book, again, which translates as Our Path Against Putschism, denounced the March action as the, quote, greatest Bakuninist putsch in history, end quote. The party misevaluated the, quote, subjective factor, end quote. Rather than establishing a viable relationship to the working class, the party substituted itself for the class, quote. Any action that expresses solely the political needs of the Communist Party and not the subjective needs of the proletarian masses is in itself defective, end quote. Levy. Moreover, the political imperatives that triggered the March action were not exclusively German. As Levy wrote to Lenin shortly before the March action, a Comintern representative informed the German Central Committee that Russia found itself in an extremely grave situation, and he counseled that, quote, it is absolutely necessary that Russia be relieved by movement in the West. For that reason, the German party must immediately commence action to overthrow the regime, end quote. The Comintern, Levy concluded, was, quote, isolated from Western Europe, quote, its most important proving grounds, end quote. The lines of communication are poor and unreliable. The Comintern representative second-rate. Alluding to Bela Kun's role in the March action, Levy caustically observed that naturally Russia could not afford to send its best emissaries, quote. Western Europe and Germany became a training ground for all kinds of petty bureaucrats, end quote. Levy. The following year, Levy published Rosa Luxemburg's critique of the Russian Revolution. In his introduction, he quoted Luxemburg's earlier critique of Lenin, which concluded, quote, finally, we must frankly admit to ourselves that errors made by a truly revolutionary labor movement are historically infinitely more fruitful and more valuable than the infallibility of the best of all possible, quote, central committees, end quote. End quote. Luxemburg. Levy did not challenge the revolutionary commitment of Lenin and Trotsky, but he wondered about the future once they passed from the scene. The, quote, old guard formed a small section of the party. This situation gave rise to Lenin's, quote, deepest error. Lenin, quote, isolated and, quote, enclosed the party like a pure specimen in a laboratory, which could be maintained or improved through, quote, purification. He assumed a, quote, partition could be erected between the party and the broad masses, end quote. On this question, a, quote, deep antagonism, end quote, existed between Luxemburg and the Bolsheviks. One second. Levy represented Luxemburg in the first period of Bolshevization of the world communist movement. His loyalty to her ideas quickly ended his career in the party and propelled him willy-nilly on a route parallel to Western Marxism. He concluded that without the spirit and sentiment of revolution, the proletarian organization was vacant and ineffectual. Quote, "It is not only the size and numbers of things, it is a spirit, Geist, which blows over everything, which alone can raise the proletarian revolution," unquote, to its greatness. Lenin and the Bolsheviks failed to weigh the cultural atmosphere of Western Europe, which damned the insular party to irrelevancy. Lenin's ideas and organization were not, quote, "absolutely false," unquote, but bore the imprint of the specific stages of the Russian Revolution: absolutism, feudalism, illegality. Quote, "Certainly in the Western lands there is a subjugation of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, but the bourgeoisie practices its domination in the form of, quote, democracy. These were the conditions in which Rosa Luxemburg lived and worked," end quote. Levy. The challenge to revolution by command or example pulsated through Rosa Luxemburg's work. The proletariat as the actor/subject of revolution defined Luxemburg's central loyalty. Luxemburg distrusted the substitution of party leadership or the bureaucracy for the proletariat. Citing Marx and Engels that the emancipation of the working class must be its own work, Luxemburg expanded, quote, "But that does not mean that some committee of intellectuals, what deceptively calls itself the leader of the working class, quote, orders or, quote, decides when and how the working class will begin on its goal of emancipation, but that the broad masses of the proletariat itself must recognize the need, the condition, and the means for emancipation, and through its own will enter into open struggle," end quote. Luxemburg. To underline her belief in the proletariat as the actor and subject, Luxemburg reversed a sentence of Marx's. In the famous passage in the 18th Brumaire, Marx stated that men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. In Luxemburg's formulation, quote, "Men do not make history just as they please, but they make their own history. End quote. Luxemburg. Yet the gap between Rosa Luxemburg and Luxemburgism might be as wide as those between Marx and Marxism, and even Lenin and Leninism. On a series of issues, nationalism, imperialism, and organization, Luxemburg delineated a unique position distant from the major contemporary Marxists, Bernstein, Kautsky, and Lenin. Footnote. For one discussion of the economic issues, see my article, The Politics of Crisis Theory, published in Telos, 1975. End footnote. Yet the gap between Rosa Luxemburg and Luxemburgism might be as... where am I? Skipped. The difficulty of grasping the specific contours of her work is no reason to dissimulate it into the prevailing orthodoxy. By dismissing some of her texts, especially her analysis of the Russian Revolution, as products of her mis- or limited information, and by reinterpreting several others, her heresies are explained away. Lately, the effort to certify her orthodoxy has increased. Footnote. Arnold Reisberg denounces as anti-communist the interpretation of a Luxemburg-Lenin antagonism. He stresses the rapprochement of Luxemburg and Lenin after 1905, and he cites from a letter of Luxemburg welcoming the Russian Revolution. See his book Lenin's Beziehungen zur deutschen Arbeiterbewegung, published in 1970 in Berlin. Norman Garris, in the book The Legacy of Rosa Luxemburg of 1976, belittles her critique of Lenin. J.P. Netto also places little importance on it. See his book Rosa Luxemburg, Volume 1. And footnote. And, this is a thing, too, especially, like Rosa Luxemburg's critique of the Russian Revolution was really damning early. The Russian Revolution, when she wrote that piece, had only been in operation for a year. So it didn't even get to see any of, she was, seeing things that even Western anarchists were not quite seeing yet in the Bolshevik Revolution. End footnote. Rosa Luxemburg's evaluation of the Russian Revolution cannot be easily dismissed, however, nor can it be severed from her 1904 critique of Lenin. Luxemburg was one of the few who possessed the linguistic and political knowledge to critically appraise Lenin's organizational proposals, and she did so when Kautsky had barely heard of Lenin. Footnote. Oh, never mind. She was one of the... If Marxism cannot be satisfied with attaining insight ex post facto, it must not be forgotten that Rosa Luxemburg advanced prescient criticism not only of the Russian Revolution in 1918, but of Bernstein in 1899, Lenin in 1904, and Kautsky in 1910. Against a generally dismal record of Marxists, Luxemburg's historical accuracy was superb. In the wake of the Russian Revolution of 1905, Luxemburg did draw closer to Lenin. However, substantial differences remained. Footnote. Oh, never mind. Where the hell am I? The 1905 Russian Revolution partially provoked the issue of the mass strike among German socialists, and it led to Luxemburg's alienation from Kautsky. To limit its use, Kautsky argued that although effective in Russia, the mass strike was inapplicable in Germany. Luxemburg contested Kautsky's reasoning of the, quote, complete antagonism of Germany and Russia, end quote. The mass strike did not express peculiar Russian conditions, but rather a general class struggle. Moreover, when Plekhanov charged Lenin with Blanchism, she partly retracted her own criticism. Quote, there might be traces of Blanchism in the organization plan that Lenin presented in 1902, end quote. Luxemburg wrote in 1906, quote, but that lies in the past, ... The errors were corrected through life itself, and there is no danger they could be repeated, end quote. 12 years later, she charged Lenin and Trotsky with Jacobinism. Footnote. Yet she retained her reserve vis-a-vis the Bolsheviks. See her comments to the 1907 RSPD conference in the article Parteitag der Sozialdemokratischen Arbeiterpartei Russlands, published in 1907 in London. End quote. End footnote. Luxemburg did not worship spontaneity uncritically, nor did she fully escape significant ambivalences. Luxemburg did retain an unswerving commitment to the proletariat as the subject of history, however, and she conceived this not simply as a philosophical statement, but as a political statement. Here, Luxemburg differed with Bernstein, Kautsky, and Lenin. Each crippled the process of subjective development of the proletariat. Luxemburg indicted Bernstein and the revisionists for suppressing the, quote, subjective factor of the socialist transformation, end quote. Luxemburg. Bernstein and the revisionists conflated means and ends, or Bernstein and the revisionists misinterpreted trade unions as a goal and not as a means of awareness and consciousness. For Luxemburg, the process of the proletariat attaining class consciousness constituted the heart and soul of revolution. One reformist presented the choice of aiming a real pistol at the ruling class or the, quote, pistol of parliamentary majorities. Luxemburg believed that this missed the essence of Marxism, quote, the power of the class-conscious proletariat, end quote. Luxemburg. Footnote. See Lelio Basso's book, Rosa Luxemburg, Dialectic, the Revolution, published in 1969. And see Luxemburg's piece, Social Reform or Revolution, published in Selected Political Writings. Luxemburg also broached a psychological dimension to this subjectivity. Although this was not decisive to her analysis, it marked a typical Western Marxist motif. The subject of history, the proletariat, was not simply a theoretical dream, but flesh and blood, thought and feelings. Proletarian passivity could not be cleaved from psychological passivity. That Luxemburg raised the issue in her 1904 critique of Lenin suggested the very different impact and consequences of industrialization on the Western and Russian proletariats. Luxemburg reviewed the book One Step Forward, Two Steps Backward in 1904, with which What Is to Be Done represented Lenin at his most inflexible. Lenin celebrated the factory as a model for revolutionary organizations, and he derided criticism of the factory as aristocratic and intellectual. Quote, "For the factory, which seems only a bogey to some, represents that highest form of capitalist cooperation which has united and disciplined the proletariat, taught it to organize and placed it at the head of all other sections of the toiling and exploited population. And Marxism, the ideology of the proletariat trained by capitalism, has been and is teaching unstable intellectuals to distinguish between the factory as a means of exploitation, and the factory as a means of organization, discipline based on collective work, The discipline and organization which come so hard to the bourgeois intellectual are very easily acquired by the proletariat just because of his factory, quote, schooling, end quote, Lenin. In One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. To Luxemburg, the model was critically flawed and obstacle to revolution. To the extent that the Marxist organization imitated factory discipline and organization, it betrayed revolution. The Marxist or social democratic organization did not adopt and generalize past bourgeois formations, but it reconstructed them from the inside. The revolutionary organization required, quote, a complete revision of the concept of organization, a whole new content for the concept of centralism, and a whole new conception of the reciprocal relation of the organization and struggle, end quote. Luxemburg. Quote, independent direct action of the masses, end quote, belong to the nucleus of the revolutionary organization. Consequently, it cannot be, quote, based on blind obedience nor on the mechanical subordination of the party militants to a central power, end quote. Luxemburg, in the article Organizational Questions of Russian Social Democracy, 1904, and footnote. I don't know why I said in footnote, end quote. Or, I don't know. The quote was Luxemburg. Luxemburg believed that the discipline and obedience instilled by factory life did not encourage but crippled revolutionary action, is to be undone, not prescribed. Luxemburg stated, quote, socialism in life demands a complete spiritual transformation in the masses degraded by centuries of bourgeois class rule, unquote. Luxemburg distanced herself from Lenin's glorification of, quote, the educational influence of the factory on the proletariat, which makes it immediately ripe for, quote, organization and discipline, end quote. The, quote, discipline which Lenin has in mind is implanted in the proletariat not only by factory, but also by the barracks, by modern bureaucratism, in short, by the whole mechanism of the centralized bourgeois state. It is nothing but an incorrect use of the word when at one time one designates as, quote, discipline two so opposed concepts as the absence of thought and will in a mass of flesh, with many arms and legs moving mechanically, and the voluntary coordination of conscious political acts by a social stratum. There is nothing common to the corpse-like obedience of a dominated class and the organized rebellion of class struggling for its liberation. It is not by linking up with the discipline implanted in him by the capitalist state, but by breaking up rooting this slavish spirit of discipline, that the proletariat can be educated for the new discipline, for the voluntary self-discipline of social democracy. Okay. Luxemburg. God, that's so good. And again, that's from the Organizational Question of Russian Social Democracy. Luxemburg's Russian Revolution, the book, or the essay, which is on this channel, by the way, does not require extensive discussion, yet its West European perspective is often minimized. She had not condemned the Bolshevik practices in themselves, but in regard to their impact on Western Europe. Their success encouraged slavish imitation. This was the danger. She feared that the European working class would succumb to imitating the Bolsheviks. Therefore, she wanted to delay founding the Third International until active West European parties could check the influence of the Bolsheviks. She also resisted adopting the name, quote, Communist Party as foreign to German revolutionary traditions. Footnote. See Peter Luschke's book Der Bolschewismus im Urteil der deutschen Sozialdemokratie, 1903 to 1920. See Julius Braunthal's book History of the International, Volume 2, 1914 to 1943. Weber's book Die Wandlung des deutschen Kommunismus, Volume 1, and the introduction by Hermann Weber to Der Gründungsparteitag der KPD, published in 1969. And footnote. Nor was Luxemburg in doubt about the decisive contextual effect of the Russian Revolution, the absence or failure of the West European revolutions. This failure exacted a double toll. It increased the attractiveness of the successful Bolsheviks and at the same time deformed their practices. Her analysis of the Russian Revolution moved in these parameters. External circumstances damaged revolutionary practices. Consequently, the Russian Revolution was less a model to be emulated than it was an example of the difficulties of isolated socialism. Luxemburg set herself against the gravitational pull of success. Just a side note, I think this is not the exclusive thing. Maybe I'll say some more things about this. But the two things that she was really criticized, that from my memory of that piece, is for one, just like the dictatorial methods, and like the replacement of like popular democratic procedures, popular democratic administration with the dictatorial powers of the top ranks of the Bolshevik Party. Also, she made major criticisms of what could be called the bourgeois features of the Russian Revolution. Lenin's talks about like national self-determination as opposed versus, which is not the same thing as working class self-determination in this context. National self-determination would be bourgeois national self-determination in her view. And the other thing that I think was very important to her was Bolshevik land policy. She basically accused the Bolsheviks, and I think correctly so, and I think a lot of people would say she was correct in doing this, of basically instituting basically facilitating and overseeing a bourgeois revolution in the countryside, in which major land holdings, as the aristocracy was broken down, and the land holdings were broken up into private peasant holdings. This is an earmark of a society transitioning from feudalism to capitalism, and not a society transitioning from capitalism to socialism. And there's like so like she criticized basically like the land to the peasants decree, which obviously was critical for Bolshevik support, but didn't really have very much to do with socialism. And I think that I think what's his name? God, I can't remember his name. Michael or Michael. Cannot remember this. Michael Brie or Michael Brie. It's like, I think he's associated with Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. Anyway, he has a great book, two great books that I would say on Luxemburg and Lenin. And one of the things that he talks about within his things is like I think the article is called Rosa Luxemburg's Symphony for the Russian Revolution. On the one hand, she wanted like greater democracy in the Soviet Union, or like not the Soviet Union, but like in the Bolshevik state. She wanted greater democracy there. Like she wanted like the preservation of like the Constituent Assembly. I don't think she really talks too much about the power of the Soviets. I'm not sure. I can't really remember too much, but that would be in line with her the overall thrust of what she had to say. But very important for her. But she kind of wanted this thing. She kind of wanted like have her cake and eat it too. She wanted to like increase the democracy, the democratic character of the Bolshevik Revolution, while totally rejecting Bolshevik concessions to democratic demands of the peasantry. Right. On the one hand, she opposed the Bolshevik land policy, but also understanding like that was a democratic response to the overwhelming majority of the population. So, I think that you know, I think she was just coming. I think she was just kind of like coming to grips with like, the difficulties and contradictions of like, the notion of permanent revolution and like the notions of like where actually Russia stood in terms of historical development, because a lot of people obviously would like to the Bolsheviks especially and other people would have liked to have characterized the USSR, or the Russian Empire that the USSR inherited, as capitalist in character. But for the vast majority of the space, it was not capitalist in character, and even in places where, in the more industrialized areas, you couldn't really quite say that agriculture was capitalist at all, right? There was still very much a large place for non-market dependent, safety first, self-subsistence agriculture on the part of the peasantry, which is not capitalist at all. In fact, the earmark of capitalist agriculture would be the market dependency of agricultural production, and not like peasant landlord relationships or whatever. The country was not capitalist in character. So, and a lot of people kind of recognize these kind of like distinctions and stuff, but their kind of view was like, okay, well, like especially Trotsky, and a lot of people say that Lenin became a Trotskyist in 1917, in the sense that he thought some kind of socialist revolution became imminent, when as for like the longest time, his politics were basically that like what was on the horizon in Russia was a bourgeois democratic revolution. At least that's my understanding of it. So a lot of people say like, that's part of the reason why Lenin shocked so many of the Bolsheviks, is because he actually did reverse himself. It wasn't a reverse on the part of like the Bolsheviks when he came and gave his like April theses. Like he was actually like subverting his own vision from what it had been historically. So there's this kind of thing. It's like, okay, if the Russian Revolution is going to be isolated and not have anything fall back on it, what else could it be but a bourgeois revolution? So like, yeah, like, and then people try to say things about like, oh yeah, like the Bolshevik Revolution proved that you don't need to be like a highly developed country to have a communist revolution. It's like, you can't actually do, if by what communist or socialist means is actually substantial change in like relationships of production to one of like the free associated producers, and have it kind of any kind of like character of like democratic high productivity, those kind of things. It actually does matter. Capitalism does in fact create the material infrastructure, does actually substantially socialize the means of production within the confines of private property, to the point where they could become the collective public come under collective public ownership, in a way that was actually the expropriation of the expropriators, and not just like the expropriators of the small peasant direct producers who privately own their land. Basically, sorry, I'm going off track here, and it's not even what this is about. But basically, there was a degree to which Rosa Luxemburg, and I think this is a very brilliant essay, Rosa Luxemburg kind of wanted contradictory things out of a socialist revolution that took place in a society that was not yet substantially capitalist, and in any meaningful sense of the term. So what else could it be but like peasant revolution, a national peasant revolution against feudalism and absolutism, as opposed to a revolution that was going to establish socialism on some kind of general nationwide scale, if that's even possible. Anyway, there's just some thoughts that are just coming to my mind right now. Where the hell am I? The brutal international situation dictated the brutality of the Russian Revolution. The, quote, complete failure of the international working class allowed few choices. Quote, under such fatal conditions, even the most gigantic idealism and the most storm-tested revolutionary energy are incapable of realizing democracy and socialism, but only distorted attempts at either. End quote. Luxemburg had no doubts the Bolsheviks must be supported enthusiastically. What they created, quote, under the conditions of bitter compulsion and necessity, and, quote, however, cannot be regarded by the international working class, quote, as a shining example of socialist policy, end quote. Luxemburg. The abdication of the international proletariat, she reaffirmed at the close of her analysis, dominated the events of the Russian Revolution. Quote, the starting and end term, end quote, of this abandonment was the, quote, failure of the German proletariat. Under these conditions, socialism was necessarily distorted. Quote, the danger begins only when they take a virtue of necessity and want to freeze into a complete theoretical system all the tactics forced upon them by the fateful circumstances and want to recommend them to the international proletariat as much as a model of socialist tactics. End quote. Luxemburg. The Russian Revolution. This guided her critique. She did not recommend choices that the Russian Revolution did not have. A little bit. She a little bit did. She criticized undemocratic policies, not to reform the Bolsheviks, but to break decisively with anti-democratic tactics of German socialism. The revolutionary action of the German proletariat cannot, quote, be called forth in the spirit of the guardianship methods of the German social democracy. It can never again be conjured forth by a spotless authority, be it that of our own, quote, higher committees, end quote, or of the, quote, Russian example, end quote. Luxemburg. In words that recall Marx and Labriola, Luxemburg declared, quote, not by the creation of a revolutionary hurrah spirit, but quite the contrary, only by an insight into all the fearful seriousness, all the complexity of the tasks involved, only as a result of political maturity and independence of spirit, only as a result of a capacity for critical judgment on the part of the masses, only thus can the genuine capacity for historical judgment be born in the German proletariat, end quote. Luxemburg, the Russian Revolution. New section, section 2. The second political dispute that the philosophical conflict echoed was, according to Korsch, quote, the disagreement that culminated in the years 1920 to 1921 between the radical left tendency led by the Dutch communists Pannekoek and Gorder and the Russian Bolshevik faction led by Lenin, end quote. Korsch. To get back to the footnotes. Okay. Marxism and philosophy. This was not a minor squabble, but in the first period of the Comintern, a decisive threat to Soviet Marxism, nor was it confined to the small Dutch party. German communism, in which Pannekoek and Gorder played roles, was equally menaced. Moreover, as Lenin himself discussed, the left tendency stretched across Europe. That a small band of Dutch Marxists predominated in what became known as, quote, left communism may not be entirely fortuitous. Gorder observed that Holland was the oldest bourgeois society in Western Europe, older than England and France. By the very length of its rule and its victories and power, the Dutch bourgeoisie profoundly dominated Dutch society. The bourgeois, quote, spirit, Geist, saturated the entire people. Quote, there is no country more bourgeois than Holland, end quote, announced Hermann Gorder. Quote, no country where the bourgeois spirit is more deeply rooted, end quote. This advanced post of bourgeois society spawned advanced critics and theorists, at least the Dutch Marxists, or what became known as the, quote, Dutch school, first coherently elaborated principles later adopted by quote, left communists. The singular impact of bourgeois culture and ideology on the working class constituted their point of departure. Their Marxism incorporated categories of Geist, mind, culture, and consciousness. Prior to the break with the Bolsheviks, Pannekoek argued that these categories were more than categories. They imbued social relations. Marxists could ignore them only by paralleling a revolutionary transformation. For instance, Gorder's book, Der historische Materialismus, Historical Materialism, published in 1908, asserted that Geist pervaded the commodity society. The power of the bourgeoisie rested as much on its spiritual as its military or political arms. For the socialist, spiritual propaganda was not extraneous, but essential. Quote, Geist must be revolutionized. End quote. Hermann Gorder. Although such statements might belie the materialism of Marx, they must be evaluated in the light of their specific political context, the issue of the pre-World War I socialist movement. Unlike Germany and the Netherlands, the pre-war debates between the revisionists and the radicals among the socialists led to a complete break. In 1909, the Dutch Socialist Party, SDAP, expelled the radicals, who then formed a competing and smaller party. Many of its members later entered the Dutch Communist Party. Before their expulsion, Pannekoek and Gorder, as well as Henrietta Rolenthulst, sharply criticized the SDAP for its, quote, anti-socialist tendency, end quote. Namely, its, quote, search for direct success, the approaches to burger democracy. I don't know, I guess that's supposed to be bourgeois. The abandonment of the class standpoint, end quote. These Dutch had already distinguished themselves as uncompromising critics of revisionism, which added to the prestige as post-World War I critics of Soviet Marxism. Footnote. See in general S. Schur's article, Anton Pannekoek and the Origins of Leninism, which is on this channel. Eric Hansen's article, Crisis in the Party, Die Tribuna Faction, and Origins of the Dutch Communist Party, published in 1976. Paul Maddox's article, Anton Pannekoek, 1873 to 1960. In Pannekoek, Leninist Philosopher. See J. Mergner's edited volume, Gruppe Internationale Kommunisten Hollands, published in 1971. Hans Bach's article, Zur Geschichte und Theorie der holländischen Marxistischen Schule, which is an introduction to Pannekoek and Gorder's Organisation und Taktik der Proletarischen Revolution, edited by H. Bach. Serge Bishian, I can't say this guy's names. Bishianaire, I don't know. Pannekoek and the Workers' Councils. Eric Hansen's article, Dutch Social Democracy and Agrarian Policy, 1894 to 1906. Paul Maddox's article, La Prospettiva della Rivoluzione Mondiale di Anton Pannekoek, published in 1973. Cajo Brendel's article, Die Gruppe Internationale Kommunisten in Holland, published in the Jahrbuch Arbeiterbewegung, edited by C. Pozzoli. I think that's Claudio Pozzoli, 1974. End footnote. In 1906, Pannekoek moved to Germany to participate in the newly founded SPD party school. The school, a stronghold of the anti-revisionist left, included Luxembourg. Pannekoek's proposal for his course, titled Historical Materialism and Social Theory, included a section on the human and cultural sciences, Geisteswissenschaft. Kautsky, to whom the proposal had been sent, balked. Pannekoek retorted that, quote, a clear understanding of the role and nature of spirit and the spiritual, bracket, die Rolle und die Wesen des Geistes und des Geistigen, end quote, was imperative. For instance, where am I? Oh, no. With Luxemburg, Pannekoek was drawn into the debate on the mass strike that transpired in the German party, and like Luxemburg, he criticized Kautsky. Pannekoek's analysis recalled Gorter's. The categories of subjectivity and Geist commanded. Over the next 10 years, the contours of his position changed little. Pannekoek articulated the same principles against Kautsky in 1912 and the Comintern in 1920. Pannekoek posed some elementary questions. Given its numerical and economic superiority, why had not the proletariat attained power? How did a small exploiting minority, the bourgeoisie, dominate a larger mass? The conventional answer of the political and military muscle of the bourgeoisie did not suffice. On a raw empirical level, the working class possessed the greater power. Yet the cultural superiority of the bourgeoisie compensated for its material weakness. The bourgeois minority controlled the vehicles of culture and education, schools, churches, newspapers. By these means, bourgeois values and perspectives infected the masses. Quote, this intellectual dependence, geistige Abhängigkeit, on the bourgeoisie is one of the major causes of the weakness of the proletariat. End quote. The cultural atmosphere mediated and sustained the exercise of power. Quote, cultural power, geistige Macht, is the most powerful force in the human world. End quote. Yet the technical reason for the reign of the bourgeoisie is not to be forgotten. It also wielded a superior organization, the state. This analysis prompted two conclusions. The proletariat is faced with two tasks: attaining knowledge and an organization to challenge the state. Unlike the purely objective factors, such as the size of the proletariat, these allowed choice and decision. Knowledge was, quote, knowledge was the, quote, first and simplest form of class consciousness, end quote, and enabled the proletariat to free itself from, quote, spiritual dependency, end quote, on the bourgeoisie. Organization could not be severed from class consciousness. This was the cutting edge to Pannekoek, anticipating Lukács. Class consciousness and organization were more than connected. They nearly merged. The proletariat could not militarily defeat the bourgeoisie, nor could it compete with state power. The fiber and strength of the proletarian organization lay rather in its solidarity, esprit, and discipline. The specific virtues of the proletarian organization, which negated individualism, were foreign to the bourgeoisie. The proletarian organization transcended a collection of individuals formally bound together. At its marrow were bonds, commitments, and relationships. For Pannekoek, these surpassed economic and political loyalties. Shading into a cultural and spiritual dimension, quote, the essence of this organization is something spiritual, geistiges. It is the complete transformation of the proletarian character, end quote. Referring to his proposal to curb use of the mass strike or mass action, Pannekoek charged Kautsky with, quote, actionless waiting, end quote, quote, passive radicalism, end quote, and more gravely, misconceiving the nature of organization. For Pannekoek, subjectivity, class consciousness, and organization welded together. They constituted the very essence and hope of the proletariat. The ethos of the proletarian organization not only rendered it resilient, but signaled the commencement of socialism. It carved out territory beyond bourgeois individualism. In the continuation of the debate, Pannekoek responded to the countercharge that the, quote, spirit of organization was ethereal, floating above society. To Pannekoek, it permeated and defined the proletariat. Kautsky failed to distinguish a proletarian organization from a whist club or any other group. Its statutes and funds were required. If statutes and funds were required, they did not constitute a working class organization. Kautsky attended only the, quote, external form of organization, end quote. The internal processes, however, were critical. These sustained relations that challenged the domination of the bourgeoisie. Nor were they mystical or irrelevant. They included the transformation of the, quote, character of the proletariat. Both the strength of the proletariat and its emancipatory capacity rested on these processes. Quote, the development of the proletariat organization in itself signifies the repudiation of all the functions of class rule. It represents the self-created order of the people. End quote. Pannekoek. In the article Marxist Theory and Revolutionary Tactics. There's a footnote that I missed that says, In Lenin's, quote, post-mortem of this debate, he generally agreed with Pannekoek. Quote, in this debate, it is Pannekoek and not Kautsky who represents Marxism, end quote. State and Revolution. End footnote. The source for some formulations of Pannekoek in the Dutch school was not so much Hegel as Joseph Dietzken, who lived from 1828 to 1888. Especially after the turn of the century, Dietzken, a tanner and an autodidact, attracted a group of enthusiastic adherents. The skeptical, including Marx, doubted his real achievements. From an independent and isolated standpoint, he completed or complemented historical materialism. He drew on Feuerbach more than Hegel and wrote to Marx that, quote, Feuerbach showed me the way, end quote, Dietzken. In fact, Marx bemoaned to Engels that, quote, precisely Hegel, he, bracket, Dietzken, and bracket, did not study, end quote, Marx. Dietzken's impact was limited. Pannekoek noted in 1902 that he had not until then, quote, exerted any perceptible influence on the socialist movement, end quote, Pannekoek. Nevertheless, the Dutch school devoted much attention to Dietzken. Pannekoek wrote incessantly on Dietzken. Gorter translated Dietzken into Dutch. Roland Holst wrote a book on Dietzken. Footnote. For a brief survey of Dietzken's thought, see Predrag Vranitzky, Storia del Marxismo, Volume 1, published in Italian in 1973. I think that book is pretty well revered. See also Lloyd D. Easton's book, Empiricism and Ethics in Dietzken, published in 1958. And Vittorio Ancarani, La teoria della conoscenza del primo Dietzken, 1866 to 1869. Dietzken to Marx is cited, blah, 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 where am I? See Pannekoek's article, The Position and Significance of Joseph Dietzken's Philosophical Works, published in 1902. Introduction to Joseph Dietzken, The Positive Outcome of Philosophy, published in 1906. So I guess that Pannekoek's thing was the introduction. One of Dietzken's most enthusiastic defenders was the German-American socialist Ernst Untermann. See his obsessive treatment in the book Die logischen Mängel des Engeren Marxismus, Georg Plekhanov et Ali gegen Joseph Dietzken. Ernst Untermann, who also translated Labriola, was convinced they supplemented each other. See his article, Antonio Labriola and Joseph Dietzken, in Labriola's Socialism and Philosophy. Untermann juggled other contraries. Untermann also managed a gold mine. See Daniel Bell's book, Marxian Socialism in the United States, published in 1967. See Henrietta Roland Holst's book, Joseph Dietzken's Philosophy, published in 1910. End footnote. Dietzken's work and most important work, titled The Nature of Human Brainwork, published in 1869, extended dialectics to conceptual and abstract thought. What Dietzken achieved is less important than what the Dutch found in him, a valuable mental and intellectual supplement to Marx. The, quote, weak spot in Marx, according to Pannekoek, was he never fully explained how mind, Geist, was entangled in the material process. Marx affirmed and proved the general dependence of mind on the material conditions, but did not set forth the specific links. Here Dietzken entered. Footnote. For a discussion of Pannekoek and Dietzken, see John Gerber's article, The Formation of Pannekoek's Marxism in Missionnaires, Pannekoek and Workers' Councils. See also Caio Brendel's Anton Pannekoek, Theoreticus van het socialisme. Uh, yeah, I don't have John Gerber, that essay by John Gerber, at least I don't think I do, but I do have his book on Pannekoek on this channel. Pannekoek, see Pannekoek's article, Joseph Dietzken's Philosophical Works, published in 1913. End footnote. Refracted through Pannekoek, Dietzken illuminated subjectivity and consciousness. To follow Pannekoek, quote, there is no lack of economic development. The material world had long been ripe for socialism. What is lacking is men, end quote. Pannekoek. Mankind is not a, quote, marionette of economic forces. These forces dominate by means of ideas and perceptions through the mind. Reversing Marx and following Luxemburg, Pannekoek stated that mankind does not make history as it pleases, but it makes history. Quote, spirit must actively intervene. Economic development will yield social revolution only insofar as it produces in the spirit, Geist, of men's revolutionary thought and revolutionary will. This is where Dietzken's contribution lies. Marx gave us the science of social and human action. Dietzken gave us the history of the human spirit. End quote. Pannekoek. A later discussion of Dietzken by Pannekoek can be found in Lenin as Philosopher, published in 1938. New section, section 3. With the rise of, quote, left communism in 1919, the Dutch Marxists received wider European attention. For orthodox Marxist, quote, left communism passed into history only by way of denunciation in Lenin's book, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. In the Leninist vocabulary, the quotation marks around, quote, left crystallized the definition. Quote, left communism was left in name only. Nothing stood left of the official communist parties. Quote, left communism was more than a theoretical aberration. However, in 1929 to 1920, it was the threat to the Comintern. Quote, left communism surfaced throughout Europe. It did not constitute a coherent formation, but a series of groupings, organizations, and journals. Pannekoek and Gorder were prominent in several. For instance, in the first year of the Comintern, secondary bureaus or secretariats were established in Amsterdam, Berlin, and Vienna to coordinate European activities. Two in particular challenged the Comintern by adopting, quote, left positions, Amsterdam and Vienna. The Amsterdam Bureau included Gorder, Rolandhorst, and Pannekoek, quote, its spiritual leader, end quote. It openly criticized the Comintern and even held a conference. Moscow quickly closed it for its insubordination. The Vienna Bureau fell under the sway of exiles from the defeated Hungarian Revolution, including Lukács, and met a similar fate. Footnote. On the formation of the various bureaus and offices, see James W. Hulse's book, The Forming of the Communist International, published in 1964. See Lazich and Drakovich's book, Lenin and the Comintern, Volume 1. Piero Conti's Le Divergenze fra gli uffici europei del Comintern, 1919-1920, published in 1972, and Boris Nikolaevsky's book, Les Premières Années de l'Internationale Communiste, d'après les récits du, quote, camarade Thomas. published in 1965. I see Gorder's Opportunism and Dogmatism, published in The Workers' Dreadnought in 1920. The Amsterdam Bureau lasted only several months before being shut down as, quote, leftist. In that brief period, it issued a bulletin and held a conference. For the conference, see its own report, Conference of the Third International, published in Bulletins of the Sub-Bureau in the Amsterdam of the Communist International. The first bulletin opened with an announcement by Henrietta Roland Holst and contained a criticism of Zinoviev on the sensitive issue of parliamentarism. Quote, the main lines laid down by the Moscow Secretariat have not since proved sufficient in all practical cases, end quote. And that's from Henrietta Roland-Holst, Comment on Theses Concerning Parliamentarism, published in Bulletin of the Provisional Bureau in Amsterdam of the Communist International, No. 1, February 1920. End footnote. The organ of the Comintern Bureau in Vienna was Kommunismus, which printed many of the essays that later composed the book History and Class Consciousness. It also published Pannekoek. The same roles were assumed in Italy by Bordiga's Il Soviet, which published Lukács and Pannekoek, and in England by Sylvia Pankhurst's Workers' Dreadnought. And it's always important to keep in mind the distinctions between the Italian and the Dutch-German, because for what was important for, above all for Bordiga, it wasn't anything about like self-emancipation or anything like that, or like working class democracy or worker self-emancipation, or any of those things that typically associate with council communism or the left, even the left communists in this phase. Council communism kind of develops as a theory later on. In this, Pannekoek's approach is radically different. Pannekoek is just believes in overthrow the insurrection or bust, basically. The journal, The Workers' Dreadnought, one of the best informed and cosmopolitan newspapers of the period, ran Lukács, as well as fundamental texts of Gorder and Luxemburg. These included Gorder's open letter to Lenin, discussed later, and Luxemburg's critique of the Russian Revolution, which Levy had publicized. These were theoretical icings, however, to larger political and social movements. Yeah, Levy publicized it after he was like kind of removed from power. Anyway. Footnote. For example, let's see. Workers' Dreadnought is generally neglected as a source of text and information on, quote, left communism. It published, for instance, Luxemburg's The Russian Revolution, including the article How the Book Was Written by Paul Levy, published in April 29, 1922. Even Lukács' writings appeared in its pages. See the article The Social Background of the White Terror, published in Workers' Dreadnought in 1920. Workers' Dreadnought published an early version of Gorder's An Open Letter to Comrade Lenin, published 25th of September 1920, and subsequent issues, and the full text of the final version, Open Letter to Comrade Lenin in Answer to Lenin's Brochure, published in 1921, through James Klugman, called Workers' Dreadnought, quote, remarkably well informed, unquote. See his book, History of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Volume 1, published in 1968. Walter Kendall, The Revolutionary Movement in Britain, 1900 to 1921, The Origins of British Communism, published in 1969. Some details of Sylvia Pankhurst and Workers' Dreadnought for some details on Sylvia Pankhurst and Workers' Dreadnought, see David Mitchell, the book The Fighting Pankhurst. See Pankhurst's book, Soviet Russia as I Saw It, published in 1921, for a very muted presentation of her differences with Lenin. End footnote. Quote, left communism was a political expression of Western Marxism. They are inextricably linked but not identical. Quote, left communism did not speak a philosophical language, although it contested the Bolsheviks politically. Briefly, quote, left communism in Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands wrote off parliaments and trade unions as vehicles for revolution. Lenin prescribed their use, but to the, quote, left, these institutions belonged to a reformist and bankrupt past of socialism. The communists could not at all manipulate parliaments and trade unions, as if they were neutral instruments. But by their very nature, parliaments and unions encouraged illusions in the working class about the revolutionary process. Several other principles and some sensibilities sustain these political positions. A gut hatred for authoritarianism and bureaucratization marked the, quote, left communists. They prized autonomy and self-regulation of the proletariat. Again, I would not include Bordiga in that camp. From this perspective, they amounted to a critique not only of the bourgeois institutions of the parliament, but of the vanguard and Leninist party, with the important exception of Bordiga, who was discussed in Chapter 5. Consequently, they celebrated, again with the exception of Bordiga, workers' councils, factory councils, and Soviets. Unlike parliamentary or trade union bureaucracies, these rested on the autonomy and independence of the proletariat. For, quote, for the, quote, left communists, the vanguard party shared a lethal weakness with bourgeois institutions. It substituted leadership for the self-movement of the proletariat. On its most theoretical level, the, quote, left communists justified their political positions by themes familiar to Western Marxism, the decisive role of class consciousness and subjectivity. If you're looking for more kind of like understanding about like all this stuff I'm saying about Pannekoek, I would encourage you to check out the article by what's his name? Adam Buick of the Socialist Party of Great Britain. For one, check out his article. I think he wrote the entry on Bordigism in the book edited by John Crump. I think he was also of the Socialist Party of Great Britain at this point. Maybe he wasn't at this point, but he has some connection to it. Edited by John Crump and Maximilien Rubel, where essentially Adam Buick says that, well, it's certainly true that you could call Bordiga a non-market socialist. His conception of what socialism entailed was kind of like a technocratic or expertocratic idea that had very little, if no room, for democratic input on the part of the working class. Since they viewed since Buick views socialism and democracy as like inseparable things, he's very cautious about. He would not include. You would not include Bordigism in like the non-market socialist tradition. At least that's my memory of it. I might be misrepresenting what Buick actually said, but that's my memory. Pannekoek and Gorder were closely associated with one of the few, quote, left communist groups that seriously challenged Comintern leadership, the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, the KAPD. Pannekoek provided much of the theoretical inspiration for the program of the KAPD, and Gorder personally participated. The circumstances from which the KAPD emerged are as follows. Footnote. A letter from Pannekoek to the KAPD newspaper announced his general agreement. He deferred, however, on the role of the factory councils. For a history of the KPD, see Hans M. Bach's book Syndikalismus und Linkskommunismus von 1918 to 1923, published in 1969. See also his Bericht über den Gründungsparteitag der KAPD 1920, published in Jahrbuch Arbeiterbewegung, edited by C. Pozzoli. C. Olaf Ehlau's book Die Roten Kampfer, published in 1969. It's a book. See Bernhard Reichenbach's article Zur Geschichte der Kommunistischen Arbeiterpartei Deutschlands, published in 1928. See Denis Altier and Jean Barreau, La Gauche communiste and Allemagne, 1918 and 1921. That's what's his name? Gilles Devey. Enzo Rutigliano links Communismus e Rivoluzione in Occidente per una storia della KAPD, published in 1974. And Fritz Kuhl's introduction to the book Die Linke gegen die Parteiherrschaft, edited by F. Kuhl in 1970. The Rutigliano text is essentially an anthology. The introduction by Kuhl is extremely well informed. And footnote. The circumstances from which the KAPD emerged are as follows. The KPD, under Paul Levy's leadership, pursued a dual strategy: clamp down on the quote left in the party to mollify and finally unite with the much larger and less radical Independent Social Democrats, the USPD. Already at the Second Party Congress, October 1919, the party leadership clashed with the quote left. A resolution attacked the quote left or quote syndicalist interpretation of the irrelevancy of parliamentary elections. It also sanctioned the use of trade unions and the quote strictest centralization in the party. Each of these issues, parliaments, trade unions, authoritarian leadership, provoked the quote left wing. Not only did the resolution pass, but it called for the expulsion of the opposition. This resolution, as well as dissatisfaction with the lack of activity of the KPD during the Kapp Putsch, this resolution, as well as dissatisfaction with the lack of activity of the KPD during the Kapp Putsch, formed the immediate backdrop to the most important split in the German Communist Party. In its initial years, the KAPD. At its foundation, half the membership of the KPD belonged to the KAPD. The KAPD's quote call for a new party, start in April 1920, denounced the KPD's reformism and corruption. It declared that the KAPD is quote no party in the traditional sense. It is not a leadership party, bracket Führerpartei, end bracket, end quote, and it pledged unity of the proletariat on the basis of councils. Footnote. For a statement by the KAPD, see Die Lehren des Generalstreiks, published in Kommunistische Arbeiterzeitung, April 19, 1920. The KPD initially opposed the general strike called by the Socialist Party. Quote, do not move a finger for the Democratic Republic, which is only a shabby mask for the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, end quote. KPD. In an article titled Aufruf der KPD Werden des Kapp-Putsches. This position was not maintained or obeyed by many regional KPD organizations, however. For an important study and argument about the response to the Kapp Putsch, see George Eliasberg. And footnote. The theoretical perspective of Western Marxism and the political activity of, quote, left communism intersected briefly. Political and tactical issues of parliaments, trade unions, and bureaucratic leadership predominated. Yet these political positions in turn tapped theoretical principles of Western Marxism. Tacitly as well as explicitly, revolution was dissected as a process of the subject, the proletariat, attaining class consciousness. The formulations threw into sharp relief the subjective dimension of the historical process, including its psychological contours. The program of the KAPD, May 1920, stated that the economic and political situation in Germany was, quote, overripe for revolution. Insofar as the, quote, objective conditions existed, the restraining conditions were subjective. Quote, in other words, the ideology of the proletariat is still partly the prey of bourgeois or petty bourgeois conceptual elements. The psychology of the German proletariat in its present composition carries only too clearly the marks of centuries of military enslavement, as well as marks of an insufficient self-consciousness. The subjective movement plays in the German Revolution a decisive role. The problem of the German Revolution is the problem of the development in self-consciousness. The development in self-consciousness. Selbstbewusstseinsentwicklung of the German proletariat. End quote. KAPD, 1920. Footnote. Similar analyses are reiterated in various KAPD publications. For instance, an article in the KAPD journal argued that the problem of the German Revolution was not, quote, technical, but, quote, cultural. Quote, we must place ever more strongly in the forefront the struggle for the development of the self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstseinsentwicklung of the proletariat, end quote. 1920. End footnote. In the same year as the KAPD program, Pannekoek published one of his most important pieces, World Revolution and Communist Tactics. The text that Communismus published, it also appeared as a pamphlet, included an editorial note commenting that it was a, quote, very important contribution, end quote, although it might stand in certain antagonism to the line of the Moscow Executive Committee, end quote. This was an understatement. Pannekoek observed that in the, quote, first flush of enthusiasm, end quote, for the Russian Revolution, the, quote, difficulties facing the revolution in Western Europe were underestimated, end quote. Pannekoek. The experience showed that the German Revolution will be a, quote, slow, arduous process, end quote. For this reason, tactics become more than tactics, translating into long-range choices grounded on central principles and observations. Two propositions sustained the tactical choices. The ideological and subjective pressures crippled the revolutionary process. These pressures afflicted Western Europe more than Russia. In Western Europe, the bourgeoisie dominated long and successfully. Quote, in November 1918, state power slipped from the nerveless grasp of the bourgeoisie in Germany and Austria. The masses were in control, and the bourgeoisie was nevertheless able to build this state power up again and once more subjugate the workers. This proves that the bourgeoisie possessed another hidden source of power which had remained intact and which permitted it to reestablish its hegemony when everything seemed shattered. This hidden power is the bourgeoisie's ideological hold over the proletariat. Because the proletarian masses were still completely governed by a bourgeois mentality, they restored the hegemony of the bourgeoisie with their own hands after it had collapsed. End quote. Pannekoek. The hegemony of bourgeois ideology, or the control of education, culture, and schools, constituted the concrete force that suffocated the revolution, and this hegemony, rooted in the long history of tenacious and supple bourgeoisie, distinguished Western Europe and countries colonized by Western Europeans, the United States, Austria, from the Soviet Union. The strength of the bourgeoisie, Pannekoek explained elsewhere, did not emanate exclusively from its money or arms, but also from, quote, the domination of bourgeois culture over the whole population, including the proletariat. During a century of the bourgeois period, the bourgeois intellectual life, Geistesleben, penetrated the entire society and produced a mental organization and discipline which reached and dominated the masses through thousands of canals. Thus, the resistances which the proletariat in the old bourgeois countries must overcome in itself, are much greater than in the new countries of Eastern Europe, which lack that bourgeois culture. Unquote. Pannekoek, in the article titled Der Neue Blankismus, published in 1920. The KAPD, footnote, the KAPD generally followed or borrowed these formulations on the distinction between Western Europe and Russia. The KAPD was also aware that the SPD emphasized the uniqueness of Western Europe. See, for that reason, it demarcated its position from the Social Democrats. At times, their position did approach Slavophobia. See in the KAPD monthly, Österreicher und Westlicher Kommunismus, published in 1920. Yeah, I think at this time there's like there was people that were in the KAPD who I think were eventually expelled. Can't remember their exact names. That were like so-called like national Bolsheviks in some capacity. I'm not sure precisely what that meant, but that could be coming from them. Gorder's contribution from, end footnote, Gorder's contribution from the same year took the form of a, quote, open letter to Lenin, responding to his pamphlet titled Left-Wing Communism. Gorder hammered away at the same issues as Pannekoek. Gorder paid particular attention to the, quote, powerful distinction between Russia and Western Europe, end quote, in regard to class formation. These different questions extrapolate differences in regard to class formation, these differences questioned extrapolations of tactics and principles from the Russian in the West European situation. Europe lacked a large and impoverished peasantry. Consequently, the proletariat was deprived of potential agrarian allies. The relative isolation of the proletariat compounded its task. Thrown back on its own sources and resources, it faced an entrenched bourgeoisie. Unlike Eastern Europe, in the West, the ideology of the bourgeoisie, quote, overpowered the whole social and political life. It has sunk deeper in the minds and hearts of the worker, end quote. Quote, how to uproot the traditional bourgeoisie thinking, which paralyzes the proletariat, end quote. Define the tactical problem. The conventional dependence on leaders, parliaments, and trade unions would be worse than no help. It would ratify the forms of bourgeois domination. Gorder closed his, quote, letter by repudiating Lenin's statement that the period of propaganda was past. Referring to the German, Austrian, and Hungarian situations, Gorder wrote, quote, the most serious economic crisis is there, and yet the revolution does not come. There must be another cause which brings about revolution. When it is not active, the revolution fails or miscarries. This cause is the spirit of the masses, end quote. Gorder. The neglect of the spirit, the culture, the minds of the proletariat eviscerated the Third International. By 1921, the KAPD... Sorry, one second. Footnote. This was originally published by the KAPD, Communist Labor Party of Germany, KAPD, a manifesto of the German anti-parliamentarians, published in Workers' Dreadnought, January 29, 1921. The most forceful counter-reply to Gorder not to his pamphlet, but to his presentation of views in the executive committee of the Communist International, belonged to Trotsky. And Trotsky, I don't know if this was quite at this period yet, but Trotsky was engaging in, I think it was in this period, was also the main spokesperson in the debate with Kautsky. For an abbreviated account of this session where Gorder is identified as Comrade CH, see the piece Das Exekutive Komitee der Kommunistischen Internationale, Sitzung vom 24 November, Die Kommunistische Internationale, 1920. For Trotsky's full statement, see his article on the policy of the KAPD, published in 1920, reprinted in his book, The First 5 Years of the Communist International, Volume 1. The supreme sarcasm, Trotsky replied in the name of the, quote, poor orphans of Eastern Europe, end quote, to Gorder's, quote, edifying lecture in the name of Western Europe, quote, allow me to recall that many of us participated for a number of years in the Western European labor movement, end quote. Trotsky. Like Lenin in left-wing communism, Trotsky defended the international significance and model of the Russian Revolution. Quote, in analyzing our Russian conditions and in connecting them with the march of the world revolution, we were not aided by an indigenous Russian theory, end quote. Trotsky. Several points about Trotsky's countercharges should be mentioned. Trotsky accused Gorder of approaching the world from a, quote, English insular standpoint, forgetting about Asia and about Africa, end quote, and ignoring the, quote, international character, end quote, of the revolution. In general, Gorder was not guilty of this. See for example his article Der Opportunismus in der Niederländischen Kommunistischen Partei, which defended a, quote, international perspective. Moreover, an abdication of an international perspective does not inhere in Western Marxism. That is, the argument for the specificity of West European conditions does not necessarily conclude with the superiority of Western Europe or North America. Rosa Luxemburg is a case in point. Like Trotsky, Luxemburg adopted an emphatic international view of the revolution, but Luxemburg also objected to the Russian Revolution as the universal model, and Luxemburg did so in the name of the specific conditions of Western Europe. That is also true for Pannekoek. Pannekoek's article, World Revolution and Communist Tactics, which is probably the best Western Marxist text of the period, took careful note of international developments and came close to assuming, to use a later vocabulary, a third world stance. For Pannekoek, the very difficulty of revolution in the, quote, old bourgeois countries shifted the arena to newer regions. Quote, the Russian Revolution is the beginning of the great revolt by Asia against the Western European capital, end quote. Pannekoek, World Revolution and Communist Tactics. Quote, the world revolution is not seen in its full universal significance if considered only from the Western European perspective, end quote. Pannekoek. Quote, the interests of Asia are in essence the interests of the human race, end quote. Pannekoek. Subsequently, Pannekoek defended, as did Lenin, movements of national liberation. Pannekoek also charged that Gorder's belief that the working class had been, quote, bourgeoisified was, quote, absolutely false and anti-revolutionary, end quote. However sharply Trotsky raised this issue, his reply rested on a single and slender theoretical reed, R-E-E-D. Only the labor aristocracy, quote, although rather large numerically, end quote, was, quote, bourgeoisified, end quote. Beneath this, quote, crust lay the great mass of revolutionary workers. As discussed in Chapter 6, Western Marxism implicitly or explicitly challenged the concept of labor aristocracy. And it should be known at this point that, and I don't know what the significance of this is, but he talks about in the book, Pannekoek, Gerber talks about how, like, in some private correspondences and stuff, Pannekoek becomes kind of like critically warm towards the notion of a Pax Americana, in the sense of, like, the spread of American capitalism would fundamentally happen before revolution would happen. This is in the 1950s, which is not a high point of revolutionary activity. And it's also, it's also in the brutality of the Soviet Union, of Stalinism comes more and more like apparent. Where am I? Where am I? By 1921, the KAPD had suffered its first of many splits. After several years, the history of the KAPD and, quote, left communism in Germany became the history of small groups. Orthodox Leninists relished this fate. It confirmed their criticisms of the irrelevancy of, quote, left communism. Also, it should be known that throughout the 1920s, I just actually listened to a piece today that I'd recorded before by Christoph Frangeli, which is a book, which is like a book review of a book by a guy named Marcel Bois, who wrote a history of like left opposition and left dissidents within the German Communist Party up until the Nazi takeover. And it talked in that piece. It talks about the massive splits and that were kind of like more kind of salami in character, where they just kind of like just cut anybody who had anything like critical to say that wasn't completely subservient to like the going party line at that time, like out from the party, right? So, for instance, Levy, but then also, you know, Root Fisher. What the hell's the other guy's name? Hugo or Bonds. What's it? Maslow. Other people within that within the German Communist Party, like just basically cutting out anybody who had any kind of semblance of a critical mind, or even a mind, for that matter. So the German Communist Party did not have, by any means, a rosy, seamless future after the KAPD left, in terms of holding itself together. It continued to exist as an organization, but it did so on the grounds of cutting anybody out who might have something useful to contribute. By 1921, the KAPD had suffered its first of many splits. After several years, the history of the KAPD and left communism in Germany became the history of small groups. Orthodox Leninists relished this fate. It confirmed their criticism of the irrelevancy of, quote, left communism. It is indubitably true that only for a historical moment did the factors gel in which German, quote, left communists might have decisively intervened. Nor was, quote, left communism, and especially council communism, without serious flaws. Yet their failure is a fact, nothing more. Fragmentation may not inhere in, quote, left communism. It may be a byproduct of failure and defeat, and indeed may have guaranteed them. What beclouds the historical record is the illusion that the victors, Orthodox Leninism and the Comintern, won. They too failed regularly and perhaps with fewer justifications. The hypnotic spell of success conspires to perpetuate history as a permanent defeat. Footnote. Council communism and its variants, Soviets, factory councils, workers' councils, have been criticized for political naivety, failure to confront the reality of state power, fetish of factory labor and technology, and limited social base in skilled labor. The first 2 points were raised by Bordiga in his often cogent critique of Gramsci. Several recent discussions have pursued these points. See Carl Bogg's article, Marxism, Prefigurative Communism, and the Problem of Workers' Control, published in Radical America, 1978. Bogg's article, 3 Pannekoek Books, published in 1979 to 1980 in Telos. Brian Peterson's article, Workers' Councils in Germany, 1918 to 1919, Recent Literature on the Rätebewegung, published in New German Critique, 1975. Sergio Bologna's article, Class Composition and the Theory of the Party and the Origin of the Workers' Council Movement, published in Telos, 1972. See Guido de Masi and Giacomo Marameo's article, Councils and State in Weimar Germany, published in Telos, 1976, and Barrington Moore Jr.'s book, Injustice, 1975, pages 275 to 315. Okay, and that's the end of chapter 3 of Russell Jacoby's book, Dialectic of Defeat. And that chapter is called From Philosophy to Politics, the Inception of Western Marxism I. The next chapter is From Politics to Philosophy, the Inception of Western Marxism II. Okay, thank you for listening.